I was driving in today, I was reminded of my home area. I come from the bush of Western Australia, where there's lots of broadacre farming. As we're going through the undulating hills, thought if you put a eucalyptus tree or three there and a few fences and a couple of sheep, it might be almost where I came from. So lots of similarities. The subject that I'm speaking on tonight is not a tickle under your armpits experience. So I don't intend for folks to walk away with any great revelation. That's not the intent. It's educational. However, I do hope that at the end of it we've got a little bit of inspiration, because we're talking about people who went through the darkest of valleys, and yet some of them anyway, saw a glimmer of hope, and that hope was the Messiah, Jesus. Melody just mentioned her experience in a concentration camp, and our dear host, wherever he's gone, he's disappeared. Okay, he also mentioned about being in Dachau. Well, my initial interest and understanding of the Holocaust happened while actually I was growing up in the bush of Western Australia as a very, very young lad. And I wanted to know why Australian soldiers, including my own family members, fought in the Middle East during both World Wars. And I won't go into all the details about that, but basically say that when Canada entered into the First and Second World War, your troops went across to Britain and then into Europe after that. Well, for the Australians and New Zealanders, we actually had to come up through the Suez Canal, and that's as far as we got initially. And that's where we did our basic training in both World Wars, in Egypt in the First World War, and the land of Israel in the Second World War. And from there we went and fought all over the Middle East, first before going on to the European battlefields. So I wanted to know why the Australian soldiers were there from about the age of 5. And so my interest began in Israel about the age of 5, because that's where my uncles had gone. And through that I began to read different war books, and not just little books, not comic books, but actually the Encyclopedia of the Second World War put out by the Imperial War Museum. And in that there was a large section on Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. And I can still remember the photographs. As about a 9, 10, 11-year-old, when I was reading these articles, I can still remember the very vivid photographs. And at one particular point, I went into our local town, which was about 18 miles away, to get a sports magazine. And instead of walking out with a sports magazine, I saw a book called Treblinka, which was the second most notorious of the death camps. There were 5 death camps, and Treblinka was the second worst, in which about 700,000 Jewish people were murdered. I walked out with that book instead of my sports magazine. Now, I had no Jewish background at all, and I have no Christian background. My grandmother apparently was a Christian lady, but nobody else that we're aware of, apart from an uncle. And so this interest in the Middle East, in Israel, the Jewish people, and the Holocaust began in this particular way. In time, that interest led me to Israel, but I left Australia in 1978 and went first to Europe backpacking, which many young people, even from your own country, often do. And within about a month of being in Europe, one of the first places I went to was Dachau. Okay, and I had a similar experience. Later, I went to the Soviet Union and to Poland and to East Germany as well, and visited various Holocaust-related sites. At that particular point, however, the interest in living a hedonistic lifestyle was more important than actually all that historical awareness I'd had as a kid. So it was still there, but it wasn't at that stage a serious interest I had. But once I got to Israel in 1979, that changed. I went to a kibbutz in the very north, and there were Holocaust survivors there and families of Holocaust survivors as well. So the experience I had in Israel in that first period as a non-Christian, and then after I became a Christian, I moved to Jerusalem. The experience throughout those 25 years was that virtually everywhere you turned, you brushed up against the Holocaust, because you met people who had survived. But more so, you met families of those who either had perished or had survived. I had a kibbutz family, okay, and they had a lot of their folks had perished. And you have the annual Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. in usually April and May. And in the days before that event and on the day itself, there'll be lots of documentaries, lots of interviews, and there'll be a remembrance service as well. So very, very deep and somber occasions. So every year you knew that was going to happen. There was the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and not only would I go there just occasionally by myself, many times when we had visitors, we would take them to Yad Vashem. It was almost like a rite of passage, in a sense. If you're going to come to Israel, if you want modern Israel, if you want to understand the dynamics of modern Israel, it's imperative that you go to the Holocaust Museum to get a grasp of what has happened to the Jewish people in the last 100 or so years. And so all that was preparatory for what was ultimately going to happen. In 1984, my wife Lexi and I began to attend the local Anglican church in Jerusalem, Evangelical Anglican Church. There are two. One is not evangelical. The other one is very evangelical. It's called Christ Church inside the old city of Jerusalem. And in 1986, I became the guide and historian and researcher associated with this ministry. It's over 200 years old, and it's been in the land of Israel for exactly 200 years. CMJ was established there in 1823. And so a very, very important historical location. And again, when I was there, working as the guide and the speaker to all these different groups, invariably you were actually coming up about the subject of the Holocaust. Because a lot of Jewish people, some Christians, but a lot of Jewish people would come in, and when it comes to question and answer time, oftentimes that would be the first question. Where were you Christians during the Holocaust? Weren't you Christians responsible for the Holocaust? In actual fact, to a large extent, we were. Because the vast majority of the executioners, the vast majority of those who were actually pulling the triggers, putting the Zyklon B into the gas chambers and numerous other things in the ghettos, the majority of those people were actually members of churches, were baptized members of churches. That's not to say they were born again. That's not to say they actually had a personal relationship with the Lord. But in the eyes of many Jewish people, they were still Christians. Nominal Christians, parts of churches, part of worldwide Christendom. And it's very difficult in those situations to be able to explain, well, there's actually a difference. Jewish people want to see the difference, not necessarily hear about it. And so you actually had this situation where you had to be there for the long haul and let them see the witness of Jesus in your own life. Most of my time in those early years, working as the guide at Christ Church, was developing a museum and developing what we call now the Heritage Centre, and doing specialised tours relating to the modern period of history, 1798 to 1948. And I won't go into the details about that. It's not the subject matter of tonight's message. Needless to say, though, but in that period of time, that was when the Australian and New Zealand soldiers were in the Middle East as part of the British forces, helping to liberate the land of Israel from Islamic Turkish occupation in the First World War, and helping to stop the Nazis from coming in and destroying the Jewish people in the Second World War. Because in that period of time in the Second World War, when my uncles were there and my mother's cousin was there and died, and one of my uncles died, one of the things that we're actually there to do was to stop the Italians and the Germans actually coming in and taking the Suez Canal and then capturing the land of Israel. And in 1942, the Nazis had passed a resolution at a place called Wannsee House in Germany that they were going to murder 11 million Jewish people. 11 million, in Europe and in the Middle East. And so that meant all 700,000 Jewish people who lived in the Middle East were going to be murdered according to the Nazi plan of genocide. So in 1942, when the Australian, New Zealand and British and other forces were fighting against the Germans and the Italians, they didn't realise, of course, that behind the Axis forces, behind the German and the Italian forces, was a murder squad called an Einsatzkommando, which is only very small, but they were going to go in, and there was local collaborators already in the Middle East who would then begin the process of murdering at least 700,000 Jewish people who lived in the Middle East, and that included approximately 500,000 who lived in the land of Israel. And so that was a reality. That was, in a sense, a bridge between my own Australian heritage as a family and as a nation and the Holocaust. And that was where things began to, in a sense, escalate for me when I realised, well, this was a dynamic I certainly never learnt at home when I was going through school and going through our annual remembrance services. I didn't hear from anybody that one of the outcomes of our victory at Tobruk and El Alamein particularly was that we actually helped to prevent the Nazis implementing their policy of genocide in the Middle East. I had the pleasure of interviewing lots of Israelis who were living in the land of Israel at the time, including former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, General Uzi Nakis, who helped liberate Jerusalem in 1967, and they can also remember, they've passed away, remember those events vividly. And they understood deep down it would not be good for them as Jewish people if the Germans won at El Alamein, the first major victory in October and November 1942. And some years ago, in 2017, we had the 100th anniversary of two events which are very, very significant for the Middle East. One was the capture of the land of Israel. That was a place called Beersheba, the first victory. Beersheba associated with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that was the first major victory in the liberation of the land of Israel. The Australian soldiers played a huge role in that. And we had a major event in Beersheba with prime ministers involved and all sorts. And I had the great honour of being able to give the historical presentation on that occasion. A few days later, we had another event in London at Royal Albert Hall. And that was the 100th anniversary of the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, which was the promise of the British government for a Jewish national home in the land of Israel. My co-speaker, there was two of us. My co-speaker on that occasion was a guy called David Schmidt, who was he's a Canadian by background. And we both did this together, and it was a great event. You don't get opportunities like that very often. When I was walking out, I thought, well, this is great. You know, these events are fantastic. And as I was walking back to the taxi, I sensed it was almost like someone tapping me on the shoulder and said, "That's it, Kelvin, job done." I've been involved in this research and all this work for 30 years. And suddenly it was like, that's it, job done. And I knew very, very clearly that was the Lord speaking. The Lord just giving me an indication. That's it, job done. Being a researcher and being someone who's sort of wired that way, if that's finished, there must be something else. And I was just scratching my head. What else? And I looked through all the interests I had as a kid, and I realized I'd never done anything specifically on the Holocaust. And I thought, well, what can I do that will contribute to the study about the Holocaust? So I sort of shelved it. Until in March 2018, just a few months after these major events, a very, very close friend of mine called David Pileggi, who was the minister at Christchurch, Jerusalem, contacted me and he said, "Kelvin, I got a whole lot of subjects I'd like you to research." And he went down the list. And I went down the list and I looked at them, and there was one there which just jumped off the page. What happened to the Jewish Christians during the Holocaust? I thought, yes, that is a subject that really, really interests me. It was just one of a number for David, and I remembered I'd always had this interest in the Holocaust, but I'd never done anything specifically that I felt could contribute to an understanding of the Holocaust, and this was it. What happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus? What happened to the Jewish Christians during the Holocaust? What happened to those Jewish people who were associated with the church during the Holocaust? And so began this research project. And suddenly I remembered, I've got a book. Where is it? And I've got a pamphlet. Where is it? Suddenly things began to come to light. You know, you can actually have an idea, but if the season isn't right, nothing happens. But the Holy Spirit was able to actually then lead and guide me to resource materials that I had stuck away, some boxes I hadn't yet unpacked since moving back from Israel. And so the materials just began to sort of come out of the woodwork. And once you begin to work on something, believe you me, the best research assistant in the entire universe comes to your assistance. You know who he is, don't you? He's called the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit just began to just open up things, open up my mind, and began to search and find materials. And suddenly the whole theme just began to come to light. A very deep subject. In the process of doing the research specifically on what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust, the Jewish people associated with the church, I realized I had to actually understand as much as possible the big picture. Because this was a little component, okay? But it's part of a much bigger picture. And I realized that until this point, I always knew that the Holocaust was a very deep subject and a very dark subject. And there's always a line in the sand, basically. I was never willing to step over it because I knew that once you stepped over that line, you have no choice but to get involved. It's much easier, much safer to stay on this side, okay? And you know when it's enough. But on a subject like this, I just knew I had no choice but to step over the line. And I'll admit, point blank right now, that I had numerous meltdowns. In the last number of years, there's been a number of times and I've just had a meltdown. Okay, I said, I just cannot do it anymore, and I cannot even think about it or hear about it. Just have to take a complete break. Such is the heaviness and the darkness of the subject matter. A couple of scriptures early on came to light. One of them I'll read, well, both of them I'll read now, to put this into context. The first one is from Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked or evil. Who can know or understand it? The second one is a flip of that. John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Verse 4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And so with those two scriptures, you realize, first of all, the Holocaust, the subject of the Holocaust, is very dark. It reveals the wickedness and the evil of the heart of man, of humankind. But in the midst of all that, there was some light. And listen, you don't need a great deal of light to light up a dark place. And so as I was reading through lots of materials and going to lots of archives during the years, and I've done 5 research trips into Europe and gone to the majority of the places associated with the subject matter. That included going out into forests and locating mass graves, oftentimes by myself, going to Jewish cemeteries where there are mass graves, and locations of ghettos and transit camps and concentration camps and death camps. What kept me going, in a sense, was this realization that in most, if not all of those places, there was a light shining. And it's my responsibility, as well as others as well, not just myself, to try to find evidence of those lights. Because not only are we honouring them, it's also giving us hope for when we go through dark places and dark times. So as a result of realising I had to understand the big picture, I did a lot of reading, a huge amount of reading, and sometimes on a subject matter, you sort of have to get very, very engrossed in it. And the way I'm wired is that if I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's very hard to go back to sleep. Then it's straight onto the computer because my office is right next door. And so lots and lots of hours are spent on it. But the amount of material was just increasing. And I began to get confused. And so I began to realize that in order to fully comprehend this subject matter, I really need to have a research tool. And the reason why I realized I needed this research tool was one particular occasion. I was reading about a Jewish lady, and the technical term that the Nazis used for Jewish people who were involved in the church was called non-Aryan Christian. Okay? An Aryan, A-R-Y-A-N, is a pure-blood Jewish person, a Caucasian, okay, Nordic person, a German. So anybody who wasn't one of those is a non-Aryan. That could be the Gypsies, the Roma, and the Sinti people, but particularly it's referring to Jewish people. And so here we have a person who's involved in the church who's not a German. So he's a non-Aryan Christian. So that was their technical term. So here was a story about a Jewish lady in Germany, a non-Aryan Christian. Okay, she was baptized in the Lutheran church. And she was rounded up one day and put on a train and was sent not east to Auschwitz or some other place. She was sent west and ended up in the south of France, in a little place called Gurs on the Pyrenees, right down next to the Mediterranean. And I scratched my head once, and I scratched my head again, and I thought, this just doesn't make sense. Now, I may have read that or heard about this in the past, but this is the first time I thought, no, there's something about this. This is illogical according to my understanding of the Holocaust. And so I had to do some research, further research on this little place called Gurs, where this whole trainload, up to about 10,000 German Jewish people, were sent down to this place. And the more I researched, the more intrigued I was, because I discovered that it was all part of a plan that the Nazis had of deporting 4 million Jewish people to the island of Madagascar, which is on the east coast of Africa. Now again, I must have heard of that at some stage, but it just never made sense, and I just didn't worry about it. But now I had to, because I found evidence of a situation which was part of my overall theme. Yes, they had a plan to deport 4 million Jewish people to the island of Madagascar. And that was a plan that they adopted after the Germans had invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and they inherited, so to speak, 550,000 Jewish people. What are we going to do with them? Okay, and so they decided they were going to send them, plus all the other Jewish people under their control, to this island of Madagascar. So the first batch would be the German Jewish people from the western part of Germany. They'd be sent down to the southern part of France, put into an internment camp called Gurs, and they'd wait until the British were defeated, because the British Navy ruled the sea lane, so they couldn't send them to Madagascar until the British were defeated. And we'd wait until the British either made a peace agreement or surrendered, and then would send the Jewish people to Madagascar. How serious were they? Well, they commissioned a man called Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, to draw up a plan. Hitler knew about it. Okay, all the other commanders knew about it and were writing about it. And so it was a very serious plan. It didn't work out. But I still didn't quite believe it. So one time when I was doing a ministry trip for CMJ in France, I said, listen, I'll come and do some speaking with you on one condition. I want to go down and see if this place is real. So it took us 2 days to drive down there, and it's real. We located where the camp had been. There were signs up. We found a person who had knowledge of it, introduced us to a Catholic priest who went and got all the baptismal records. I don't know if he got permission to do it, but he brought them all out because a Catholic priest had gone into this camp. Many Jewish people had actually come to faith in Jesus and were baptized, and there were the records from this camp. And so that's what made me realize that the Holocaust is a little bit more complex than I had originally thought. You see, in the back of my mind, I suppose I'd thought that once the Nazis came to power on the 30th of January 1933, they began to implement a policy of genocide. And actually, in fact, that is not the case. And so with further reading and I suppose putting together some dates and events, I began to realize there's probably about 7 distinct phases of the Holocaust. Now, this was a tool, a research tool which helped me. Okay? Other researchers and the really big historians might have their other research tools, but this helped me. So those 7 phases were: phase 1, the period leading up to 1933, the period in which the foundations were laid for the Nazi world view. And there were about 10 or 12, I think, different reasons which led to the Nazis developing their policy or their attitude towards the Jewish people, okay, and their overall worldview. And it's a whole range of different subjects. There is a little book or 2 out there which goes into that subject, and I won't go into all those reasons right now. But it's not just 1 or 2, it's about 10 or 12 different factors which you have to take into consideration to understanding what led to the Nazi worldview. So that was until they came to power. Phase 2 was the period from 1933 to 1939, and I call it the intimidation, exploitation, and emigration phase, in which they intimidated Jewish people. They exploited Jewish people in the hope that they would emigrate, would leave from Germany, thereby rendering Germany Judenfrei, okay, Jew-free. And so a whole range of different things happened during those 6 years in which Jewish people were stripped of their rights and their citizenship and hassled and intimidated to the extent that many Jewish people did leave, but the vast majority still did not. Phase 3 began when they invaded Poland in September 1939, and now there's another 3 million or so Jewish people coming under German and Nazi control. What are we going to do with them? So in short, they had a plan, they drew up a plan, they orchestrated a plan, and it's called the Ghettoization and Lublin Plan. They put all the Jewish people initially into ghettos, and then ultimately they moved them to an area of Poland around the city of Lublin, and that would be called basically a Jewish ghetto, a large Jewish ghetto, a very, very large one. And so they actually began to implement that. They actually began to bring Jewish people from different parts of the German Reich and took them over to near the city of Lublin. But it was a big plan, and ultimately realized it just wasn't going to work out. But in the process of that, many Jewish people were actually killed. There was no policy of genocide, but wherever they could actually execute Jewish people, they did so in the process. And many Jewish people, of course, later on died in the ghettos. So that was phase 3. Phase 4 was when they invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, as I already alluded to, in which now they had another 550,000 or so, bringing a total now of over 4 million Jewish people under their control. And that's what we call the Madagascar Plan. Ultimately, that didn't work because the British Navy could not be defeated. And so now we get into the next phase, and that phase was when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, June of 1941. And this, in a sense, had several gradations. Initially, a lot of Jewish men were shot because the Nazis had a policy that Jewish males were synonymous to the Bolsheviks, and they believed that all Bolshevik or commissars in the Soviet army could be killed, and so Jewish men of a certain age were just summarily executed, the same as many of the officers and commissars of the Soviet army. And so this was just men, some women and children, yes, but there wasn't a policy at this stage of unilaterally murdering Jewish women and children. Then in the end of July, there was a letter coming from Hermann Göring through to one of the Nazi leaders, Heydrich, and in that letter, it was basically a commission to complete the Jewish policy, okay, to take the Jewish policy to the next stage. So there's a little bit more to the letter, but many times the Nazis didn't state things emphatically. They sort of left it in such a way that Hitler's second in command and third in command could interpret his thoughts. And so we see the interpretation of that letter within a few weeks, because all this murdering that was taking place, primarily in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine, up to 2 million Jewish people were shot ultimately. But until that point, the murderers were primarily death squads called Einsatzgruppen. And they had police battalions and also regular Wehrmacht soldiers as well. And they would send back reports of how many people they were shooting. And suddenly, from about the middle of August, those numbers included large numbers of women and children. And so you knew that something had actually dramatically changed in the policy. And so we're getting close and closer to a point where it was actually total genocide. Towards the end of that year, we're morphing into the 6th phase, whereby now Jewish people were being brought by train from Germany, and were being taken to the east, to Lithuania, to Belarus, to Ukraine, and there they were being taken out, mostly interned, but many of them were also shot as they got off the trains. So now there was a policy of genocide across the board. So it was the same period of time when the Nazis began to realize that the shooting of people was actually not very good for the mental health of the executioners. And so that's why Himmler, the commander of the SS, made a decision that other forms of execution needed to be found. And so that's when they began to develop the gas. First of all, it was gas wagons, and then in time it was in places where gas chambers were established, beginning in Auschwitz, okay, then the other camps as well. So those camps, the idea was already being developed towards the end of 1941. And the final phase, phase 7, was after or on the 20th of January 1942, when under the Nazi leadership, they had lots of members of the German government. Different departments came to a place called Wannsee House near Berlin, and that's where they made an emphatic decision they were going to murder 11 million Jewish people. And that included people in areas not under Nazi control. Okay, so the foreign ministry would have to make arrangements with those countries to either have the Jewish people in those areas killed or transported over to Europe where they could be murdered. So with that research model set down, that helped me tremendously when I was reading through materials and looking at decisions that were made and then how those decisions were implemented, and I could begin to put them into compartments, so to speak. As I said, that's my model, the model which helped me. The other model which I found myself developing related to the Jewish people who were associated with the church. Now, there's not much material actually written on the subject matter. So you really have to dig deep. It's like trying to find little tiny nuggets of gold in a huge area of sand and rock. But with the help of the greatest research assistant in the world, whose name is the Holy Spirit, I was led by degrees to different locations. And so as I was reading through all this material, I began to realize also that when you start talking about non-Aryan Christians, you start talking about Jewish people who are associated with the church, you can see there are differences. There were differences in the types of people that were being referred to. You could see that there were some people who were definitely followers of Jesus as Messiah, who were definitely involved in the church by conviction, were followers of Jesus, or Yeshua in the Hebrew, by conviction. But others you could see that they were more culturally involved in the church. And so then I began to put together another tool which helped me, and that was 7 groups of Hebrew Christians, Jewish people who are involved in the church. So the first group would be those before 1939 who had a genuine conversion experience, who were truly born again of the Spirit of the living God, who believed that Jesus was the God incarnate Messiah, the one who came and took the penalty of death that was upon humankind, Jew and Gentile, and then rose again from the dead. Okay? And so there were many. There were many people in this category. CMJ, for instance, had a congregation in Warsaw. They had a number of involvements in other ministries as well, other areas as well. But in Warsaw, CMJ had a congregation called the Emmanuel Church in Warsaw. And the evidence is that there are about 130 adults, Jewish, who are involved in that Hebrew Christian congregation in Warsaw. So this was one ministry, and it was just one of their locations. And there were other congregations in Warsaw as well. The evidence that I've been able to discover so far is that perhaps 15 of those survived the Holocaust. So you can see the vast majority of those perished. Incidentally, the pastor from that congregation, I'll get to him a bit later, the pastor from that congregation, his name was Jacob Jocz, and it's J-O-C-Z. How do you pronounce it? It rhymes with Scotch, okay? So that's how I was told by his son to remember it. Jacob Jocz was the pastor. He was a Hebrew Christian, an Anglican minister of this congregation. He happened to be out of Warsaw when the war began. He was actually in Britain, and he couldn't get back. So he survived the Holocaust. His family had to go through it. But he survived, and he stayed in Britain during the war. Later, after the war, he became a great theologian, and he transferred over to Toronto in the 1950s and was a professor at Wycliffe College. And so that's where he actually saw at the end of his life, and I'll tell you more about his story later. So there is actually a Canadian connection, and I'll follow that story through in a minute, because it's someone that is a very significant person, and his family went through the Holocaust, and of course it's got a Canadian connection as well. And so that's just one example. So we do know that there were thousands and thousands, even into the tens of thousands, of genuine Jewish followers of Jesus in Europe prior to 1939. The second group, which is a large group, are those Jewish people who converted and were baptized, to use those words, prior to 1939 for socio-economic reasons. You have to realize that throughout Europe, during the previous 100 or so years, many professions were barred to Jewish people. Jewish people couldn't actually move into a lot of the professions. And so the only way you could actually be accepted in society for many vocations was if you were part of the host culture, therefore part of the host church. And so many Jewish people left the Jewish community and became part of the Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant denominations in the different locations spread throughout Europe. And a lot of those people obviously were not Orthodox Jews. They were totally, secular Jewish people. They had no interest in religion, so to speak, the vast majority. And so they made that transition. Now, in those situations, of course, people had to go through a catechism. If they're coming into a church, doesn't matter which denomination it is, there was some form of catechism, some form of teaching whereby they would then come in. Who knows what happens in the hearts of those people, in that process? We don't know. Well, that was quite a large group. A third group of Jewish people who are involved in the church are those who converted and were baptized, entered into the church because of marriage. Okay, they were marrying a Christian, a Gentile spouse. And so in those situations, they would also come in and they go through some form of catechism. Again, we don't know what happened in the hearts of many of those people. And that was their motive, that was their reason for becoming part of the church. A fourth group, and this is quite a large group also, are the children and the grandchildren of the first three categories. So let's say if Moshe came to faith in Jesus as Messiah in 1900, okay, or let's say that Jacob came to faith in Jesus as Messiah in 1920, there's no telling what's going to happen to their children and grandchildren in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Okay, there's no reason to believe that those children and grandchildren actually were following in the faith of the parents or grandparents. They could have been assimilated, they could have been part of the church, like I'd say many people in the Western society are in the church. They've always just gone to church, but they might never have had a heart conviction that Jesus is the Messiah. Many of them probably were not even in the church. Okay? They were now part of the host society. They had no connection to the Jewish community. They were just regular Poles or Germans or Austrians, etc., etc. So you can well imagine there might have been a lot of people in that particular category. So those are the different groups up until 1939. After the war began, of course, there were new dynamics. So in many situations, the only way that a Jewish person could escape from the claws of the Nazis would be to have a baptismal certificate. So in those situations, there were some clergy who were prepared to issue baptismal certificates for that Jewish person to survive. And again, the catechisms were there. They might have been squashed a bit. Instead of going through 10 weeks, there might have been 2 weeks. We don't know what's going to happen to the hearts of people when they're actually taken through the belief system of the church and of that particular denomination. And the Anglican Church, for instance, in Vienna, which is attached to the British consulate, we know that they issued hundreds of such baptismal certificates. Now, after the war, we know I've researched one occasion of a Dutch lady, for instance, whose father managed to get such certificates, baptismal certificates. They managed to survive. They managed to get out of Theresienstadt concentration camp and went to Switzerland. And she's actually testified that after they were free, she just ripped up that baptismal certificate, okay, because it had done its work, so to speak. It helped her to physically survive. Now, that may not be the case for all, but that was just one person. So you know that there are different events which happen in different circumstances. A sixth category are the children. And lots of children were entrusted by their Jewish parents to Christian institutions and to Christian individuals, families, for safekeeping. So how is a child going to survive in an environment which is surrounded by spies and surrounded by people who might very easily just dob you in to the Nazis or the Gestapo or to the local pro-Nazi institutions, etc., etc. How's that child going to survive? He's going to somehow have to, in a sense, pass the test. If somebody came in and said, what day is Christmas? Or what happened on Easter Sunday? That Jewish child would actually have to have some idea of those key Christian events. And so in those cases, some of those children may very well have actually come to faith, but a lot of them actually had to go through some form of Christian education. And a final and seventh group are Jewish people who in the midst of the Holocaust came into a saving knowledge of Jesus as Messiah. were born again, as we might say, who firmly believed that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel. And we do have evidence that this happened to quite a few. Some of those may later have perished, okay, because there was no guarantee that they were going to survive, because you have to realize that even if a Jewish person was part of the church, that is not a let-out clause. Because as far as the Nazis were concerned, okay, it was all about bloodline. It was not about your religious affiliation or any other affiliation. If your bloodline said you were Jewish, then you were Jewish according to the Nazis, like everybody else. Only in some situations did that baptismal certificate actually help you. Okay, but generally speaking, especially in the East, it had made no difference at all. And so you were going to end up like all other Jewish people. So some of those true Jewish followers of Jesus, people who came to faith in Jesus as Messiah during the context of the war, may have perished. There's one particular couple I researched from the Netherlands, for instance, came to faith in Jesus. This is quite an interesting little story. There was a couple, a young couple, totally secular Dutch Jews. Okay, didn't know anything about their own faith. And they weren't married at this stage. They were engaged. And so they were being told by the Nazi authorities, you can't go there. You can't go to that swimming pool. You can't go to that beach. You can't go to that restaurant. You can't go to that park. Why? Because you're Jewish. So they sort of thought, well, if I can't go to these places because I'm Jewish, I'd better find out what it means to be Jewish. Because they were secular, basically. Had no idea of what being Jewish was all about. And so in the context of beginning this search for what it means to be Jewish, they came into contact with a Dutch Reformed minister who was Jewish. He's a Hebrew Christian. Johannes Rottenberg was his name. He actually had worked with CMJ previously. And so Johannes Rottenberg was based in The Hague, Rotterdam, and then The Hague. And so this young couple ended up by coming to a meeting that this man was speaking at, and the young couple realized by the way he's speaking that he was Jewish. They couldn't get around that. But you're a Christian minister, but you're Jewish. And the guy said, sure, of course. I believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Well, that struck him. That got him. Okay, so they wanted to find out more. And ultimately, this young couple confessed faith in Jesus as Messiah. Ernest Kasuto was his name. His fiancée was Hetty Winkel. She later was found. They had to go into hiding. She was found and was later murdered close to a place called Sobibor and the eastern part of present Poland. But he survived. And he wrote a book called The Last Jew in Rotterdam. And so there we have an example. So some survived and some died. And so from those 7 different groups, you can see that it's not such an easy subject to be able to pin down with anything authoritative. A lot of people ask me, well, how many were there, Kelvin? How many Jewish followers of Jesus were there who died in the Holocaust? Do you know what my straight, honest answer is? I don't know. And you know what? I don't think we ever will know, because it's far too complex to get into it. But how do we know what's going on in the hearts of people? Okay, how do we know what's happening in the hearts of people when they're actually on the way to the gas chambers, when they're actually going out into the forest to be shot? We don't know. But what I can tell you point blank, there was a lot of witnessing happening in the 1930s. I've gone through all the journals of most of the missionary societies. That's just the missionary societies from the US and Europe and Britain. And in the 1930s, it is unbelievable how much activity these people were having, going all over Europe, where most of the Jewish people lived, going to isolated villages, getting hassled also in the process, but nevertheless going out there and distributing materials, speaking about Jesus being Messiah, really getting persecuted in the process. A huge effort was being made in the 1930s to reach as many Jewish people as possible in Europe with the message of Jesus as Messiah. Incredible. It really is incredible. So we don't know what's happening in the hearts of all these different people. Now, one of the things about numbers, and a lot of people really get hung up on the numbers, is it's very hard to determine who was a genuine follower of Jesus from those who were actually in any of those other categories. But I did do some specific research in the 2 countries thus far where I actually had access to the registration forms. And I'll just briefly explain that to you. Now, the registration forms were for Jewish people to sign all their details. So the Nazis actually had all the details of what they owned, their family members, and where they lived. Okay, so when time came for the roundups, and after the deportation came, they knew exactly where to go. And if somebody wasn't home, they wanted to find out where that person was. So they knew he'd gone into hiding or whatever else, but they had the addresses. So these were registration forms for all the Jewish people. In the Netherlands, I read about this in secondary sources, that a Nazi official had gone through all 100,000 plus registration forms and had taken aside all those that had said under religion, they're all Jewish, but under religion you could write Orthodox, Reform, no religion, atheist, or you could write Roman Catholic, or you could write Reformed or Lutheran or something else. So a Nazi official had taken out all those who said they were actually part of the church and had typed them up, and there was a little booklet. So I heard about this. I read about this. So I went to the Netherlands in part of my research with my wife's twin sister, Doreen, who speaks English, German, and Dutch. So it's very, very handy when my English is not too bad and my Dutch and my German isn't so hot at all. So Doreen and I go along, and we said to the archivist, I'm looking for this booklet. It's called The List. And the man said, okay, where is it? Oh, I don't know. That's what I've come here for. He didn't know. He never heard of it. And so we went to all these other books, and they all had secondary sources. So I didn't have a primary source. When you're doing this sort of research, you have to have a primary resource. Because it's not worth saying to Jewish people that so many tens of thousands of Jewish Christians died in the Holocaust, because they could very well say, where's your data? Where's your facts? You've got to have some tangible proof. And so as a result, my sister-in-law and I were given a whole pile, I think it was about that thick, of all the material related to the Germans and the church during the war in the Netherlands. And he said, here you are, there's your homework. So off we start going through it. Late in the afternoon, my sister-in-law says, Kelvin, I think this is it. There was a little brown book, 32 pages of very small type. I think it was about 10 different categories, and they're all there. I think it was 1,881 names. We couldn't photograph them. We couldn't photocopy them. I had to write them all down and all the material with my computer, which took about 5 days, with the help of my family and friends. And so from that material, I then had to go and I had to cross-reference every one of those names against the database of the names of the Jewish people from the Netherlands who had died in the Holocaust. And from that came out a list of about 430 of those 1,881 had actually died, were murdered. Now, that's not the final number, but at least it is a number from the data. Now, I don't know how many of those were genuine members of the church, or how many of those fitted into one of those other categories. That's for another researcher to come along next and start to work on that. But at least that's something. Then in Belgium. In Belgium, no official had done the hard work for me. I had to go and do it all myself. So for 9 days, I was in an archive, the Holocaust archive in Mechelen in Belgium, and I had to go through 45,000 registration forms, some of which were 2 or 3 pages, so that was over 100, I worked it out, over 100,000 pages in those days, and it's a whole process working out, and most of those were from different provinces, and they didn't use the same form, so they had the category of religion in different places. Thankfully, the archivist there was very, very helpful. In fact, the whole group of people there, because none of this research had been done, so it was very, very helpful. So as a result of a lot of tedious work there, going through a whole different range of different processes, I think I found out there are about 80 of those people who said they're involved in the church. It's about 600, I think, and about 80 of them we could verify had been murdered during the Holocaust. Again, we don't know how many of those were genuine followers and how many of those were actually involved in the church for other reasons. So, that gives you some idea of the numbers, but that's Western Europe. Now, most of the Jewish people in Belgium, for instance, were hidden. Most of the Jewish people were not, or a vast number of the Jewish people were not sent away to the Holocaust, also in France. So there's a very, very good reason to believe that many of the Jewish people involved in the church in those two countries survived. In the Netherlands, a large percentage of Jewish people were sent away, but many of the Protestants were actually protected by the Protestant leadership. And Lexi's grandfather actually was one of those involved in the leadership that helped in that process. The Roman Catholics, however, in the Netherlands were given a very hard time because the Roman Catholic Archbishop Johannes de Jong took a very strong stance against the Nazi policy of deporting all Jewish people. And as a result, the Nazi leadership said, "We will show you who is boss." And they made a decision towards the end of August, or towards the end of July, beginning of August of 1942, they would deport the Roman or the Jewish Catholics, Jewish people involved in the Roman Catholic Church. And many of them were sent away and were murdered on the 9th of August 1942 in Auschwitz. About 113 straight away, and then over the context of time, more were sent away. So many of the Jewish Catholics actually were murdered quite early on by the Nazis. And so there you have just a few little snippets of things related to the subject matter. That's Western Europe. But in Germany, but particularly in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and all the way down that whole area there, Romania, a different ballgame. Because in those countries, it's pretty clear from what I've researched and read so far that being involved in the church really was of no help at all. If you were known to be Jewish, there's a very, very good chance that you're actually taken away, put into the ghettos or taken into the forests or ultimately sent to any one of the 5 death camps. In those countries, for instance, if you were known to harbour Jewish people, you were executed virtually straight away. In Western Europe, that didn't necessarily happen. If you were known to harbour Jewish people, Corrie ten Boom is an example. They were sent off to Ravensbrück concentration camp, well, at least her and her sister were, but they weren't executed. A lot of the Jewish people Christians who hid Jewish people might have died, but they weren't necessarily taken out straight away and executed. That was not the case in the East. Okay? If you were known to be hiding Jewish people, the chances are that if you were caught, you would be executed straight away. How many of us would be willing to take that risk? Okay? And so if people in that part of the world were going to harbour Jewish people, then they understood full well the risk they were taking. The Greek Catholic Archbishop of Lvov, Archbishop Sheptytsky, he took a huge risk and he actually sheltered many, many Jewish people, and he actually had other people from his church doing the same. But those were, generally speaking, a bit of the exception. So there's a very good chance that not as many Jewish Christians were being hidden as might have been the case elsewhere in other parts of Europe. Again, data is hard to find, first of all, because at this stage I don't have the language skills, so I was going to go to Lithuania before the conflict began, and I'd have to employ a linguist to help out with some of that research, but much of the material would have disappeared anyway. So in those cases, we could say that quite clearly, I think, that the vast majority of the Jewish people involved in the church would have suffered exactly the same death as the Jewish people who were not involved in the church. A case example is the congregation that CMJ had in Warsaw, the Emmanuel Church, okay, where about 130 Jewish adults were in that congregation, and thus far I think I found evidence of about 15 or so who have survived. So you can see there's a very, very high percentage of those involved in that congregation were murdered in the Holocaust, either in the Warsaw ghetto or were taken to Treblinka death camp. Now I want to finish up with one particular story, or actually a couple of stories. The first one will be about this Johannes Rottenberg, okay, the one I spoke about from the Netherlands. He ultimately was arrested because he was preaching sermons that the Gestapo didn't like. Because every meeting, okay, there were Nazi agents who were sent in, particularly to congregations whose pastors of the Nazis thought were a little bit suspect. So they actually sent spies in to listen to the sermons. So ultimately, he was arrested. So too was another guy called Cohen, who was another Jewish pastor in the Reformed Church. Johannes Rottenberg was sent to 2 camps in the Netherlands first, and then ultimately he was sent to his death at a place called Mauthausen in Austria. There is evidence There's written records that in the 3 places where he went, he continued to witness and to hold services. And one of those camps in the Netherlands, called Amersfoort, very clearly stated there to be no Christian services. So what did the Reverend Rottenberg do? He held Christian services. He held services. Okay? And also when he was sent briefly to Dachau, and then later when he was sent to his death in Mauthausen. And in Mauthausen, it was a workplace where you were worked to death. And he wouldn't have lasted there very long. But there was evidence from one survivor who wrote that he led 1, if not 2, Jewish people to faith in Jesus as Messiah. Who knows how many others were influenced by the testimonies of these people? This lady called Edith Stein. Who's heard of the Edith Stein by any chance? Okay, she was actually made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. She was a German Jewish lady, came to faith in Jesus as Messiah. She was one of those that was deported from the Netherlands because of that courageous decision by the Archbishop Johannes de Jong. And there's accounts that she was like an angel. They said that she was just glowing and she was so helpful. Who knows how many people she was able to influence with the message of Jesus as Messiah. There's a guy called Isaiah Feinstein in a city in the very, very far eastern part of Romania, a very, very small place. And there was a congregation there of Jewish followers of Jesus. And there was a big pogrom in June of 1941, in which about 13,000 Jewish people were murdered. That's a pogrom was something what we saw in October the 7th in Israel. Okay, just a mass murder. And a lot of the men were then put into trains, and the trains shuttled here and back until they all suffered. Most of them suffocated and died. And there's evidence that he was witnessing right up until his last breath in that train when he died of heat exhaustion. And that's Reverend Isaiah Feinstein. And that's another one, a light in a dark place. Edith Stein was a light in a dark place at Auschwitz. Johannes Rottenberg was a light in a dark place at those different camps, ending up at Mauthausen. Okay? They're just a few examples we have. How many more were there that we don't have any clear evidence from? So I'm going to conclude now with the Polish connection, this family called Joch, 3 generations of Jewish people who followed Jesus as Messiah. Jacob Joch was the pastor from this congregation in Warsaw, one of the largest congregations of Hebrew Christians that was in Warsaw and probably in Poland. And his father, Basili Joch, also worked with CMJ in a place called Lvov. Okay, it was called Lemberg or Lvov. We know about it now. It's in the western part of Ukraine. And there was a small evangelical congregation there. The mother, Anna, was a Jewish follower of Jesus as well. And the whole family, basically, there was a family of Jewish followers of Jesus. And Jacob Joch happened to be out of the country when the war began, so he survived. And I mentioned just a while ago what happened to him. But the parents were in Lvov, and they were okay until the Nazis took control of that area, in about June or so of 1941. And now they realized they had a problem because they knew that they were, according to the Nuremberg laws, 100% Jewish. It didn't matter that they were part of the church, and it didn't matter that Basili had been a follower of Jesus and involved in the Anglican Church in Poland for about 25 years. It didn't mean anything, 20 years anyway. It didn't mean anything. According to the Nazis, they were 100% Jewish. Now, Anna could pass as a Polish lady. So she stayed in the house, and the Germans took over the house and billeted German officers and civil servants in the house. So she stayed. She spoke Polish fluently. So they allowed her to live in the kitchen. Basili, however, was most definitely Jewish, and of course, it's easier to work out if a male is Jewish than it is for a female, for various obvious reasons. And so he had to be hidden, and he was hidden in a woodshed by a sympathetic Christian for 2.5 years. Can you imagine being hidden in a woodshed for 2.5 years? And was fed, during that period of time. But in February of 1944, for various reasons, he actually said the mice and the rats were jumping around his head too much. He went back to the house. He wasn't supposed to go to the house. But he went to the house, and somebody saw him there. It was actually a lady of ill repute who was coming to visit one of the German soldiers, and she reported him to the Gestapo. Now, in that period of time, By that stage, the vast majority of the Jewish people in that region had been taken away and had been murdered. And this stage, they had what they called the Judenjagd, the Jew hunt. So they were actually going out systematically and locating places where Jewish people were hiding. How would they know where Jewish people were hiding? People would inform them. Why would people inform the Gestapo? Because they got monetary assistance. Okay? That's the reality of what was happening. Very, very difficult. And so, as a result, this man, Basili Joch, was discovered. The Gestapo came to the house, did a body search to ascertain if he was Jewish, and they took him out and shot him shortly afterwards. Anna was knocked to the ground and went unconscious. And lucky she did, because they came out back later to get her, and she was out to it, and so they left her. So she survived. But she was paralyzed initially completely, and later from the waist down. There was another son and daughter-in-law who lived in the area, and so they later obviously managed to get her, and shortly later the Red Army came in and liberated Lvov from the Germans. So she survived. Her husband died. It's quite a miraculous story. If you are interested, there is a book about this entire family out there. It's quite an incredible story how they managed to get from the Soviet region, okay, because the Soviets then took over that part of Poland. It was still part of Poland. How they got from there, and ultimately they got into the British zone. So they went right across Germany to get there. That's quite a miracle. And then she had no papers, but she managed to get into Britain. She had no passport, no Polish passport, no British passport. It's a miracle how this lady got into Britain, and her son, who was now an Anglican minister, of course, welcomed her with wide open arms. So she was there for a number of years, no pension, except for a small one from CMJ. And ultimately, Jacob Joch received this teaching position at Wycliffe College in Toronto. And so he came over with his mother. And then later in the 1950s, the German government said they would give compensation to Holocaust survivors. But of course, you'd have to prove that you were a Holocaust survivor. That's understandable, yes? Otherwise, everybody would say, we survived the Holocaust. So therefore, Jacob Joch had to actually have a lawyer here, and they had to begin writing to the authorities in Germany, and they'd write back, and they'd write back again, and this took place over a couple of years. The German authorities actually then had to employ a researcher who went to Poland, then under Soviet, well actually it wasn't Poland by that stage, I think it was part of Ukraine, so under Soviet control. And they actually found eyewitnesses who can testify, first of all, that the couple was Jewish, secondly, they was taken away and executed on the 28th of February, 1944. So anyhow, ultimately, compensation was coming forth for Anna Joch, but she died without having received the first check, in a sense, in the mail. So she'd gone through all this, they finally got to the point they're going to give her compensation, and she passed away. Jacob Joch kept all the materials. Some years ago, when I started doing this research, I did I think a 7-week tour to 17 different archives in Britain, the US, and Canada. I located the archives of this man called Jacob Joch at Wycliffe College, and he had a son, Philip, who invited me to his place. Well, I sort of invited myself, I suppose, as researchers often do. And he said, my sister and I have just found a new box of materials. And so we started to go through these materials, and a lot of stuff I knew, lots of stuff I didn't. I take photographs of everything. And then he brings out a file. And he said, I don't know what to do with this. It's all in German. I've thought of throwing it away. Anyhow, all in German, a bit of Russian, a little bit of English, and I started going through it, and I could see this date, 28th of February, 1944, written all over. Okay? And I realized, well, that's a significant date. My foreign languages are not very good, but I could work out that was the day he was executed. And then, so I had a lot of those pages. I photographed them. They were later translated into German, from German, into English, and there was the whole storyline. Not just of what happened then and there, but lots of biographical material and other events as well. That material is as scarce as hen's teeth, let me tell you. It's not that often you are able to come across so much primary evidence relating to one person, one family, who went through the Holocaust, and some died and some survived. So With that, I began to piece it all together and put together the storyline of Basili and Anayoch, and it is quite a fascinating story. And so I realized that with that material, I could put together a book relating to what was happening to all of the Jewish people in Poland who followed Jesus as Messiah. That's not every individual, but you actually are able to actually tell the bigger story by looking at one particular family. Okay, they're representative, you might say. They are a representative family of the collective. Now, it's known that there were about 4,000 Jewish Christians in the Warsaw Ghetto. The vast majority belonged to the Catholic Church. The vast majority were murdered. They haven't left testimonies. But nevertheless, we have this evidence it was about 4,000. But in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was one Jewish man called Ludwig Hirschfeld, who was a professor. He was an assimilated Polish Jew. Okay, that is to say, he was totally immersed in the Polish society. He converted and became a Catholic in order to further his academic career. So Ludwig Hirschfeld was a well-known person in his field, living in Warsaw when the Germans came in his house in a suburb, and one day he gets a knock on the door. "Are you Ludwig Hirschfeld?" Something like that. "Yes, I am." "Come with me." "Where are we going?" "To the ghetto." "Why?" "Because you're Jewish." He didn't understand what was really going on. He hadn't been part of the Jewish community for 15 to 20 years. The Jewish community thought, "No, he's not one of us anymore," etc., etc. And at one stage, the German soldiers were going through the materials. They could take a suitcase, and the suitcase fell open, and stuff fell out, including a book that he had written in German when he was in Heidelberg. And the German soldiers said, "What's this?" And so he said, "Well, that's a book I happened to write when I was working at Heidelberg University, and it's all in German." Okay? And so the German soldier said to him, "But now you're just a Jew." And he was taken away to the ghetto. And he testifies. He actually survived. He got smuggled out. And he wrote of his experiences. So that testimony also was quite rare in a sense. But when he wrote his testimony, he actually said that while he was in the ghetto, while he was associated with the Catholic Church there, he actually for the first time began to understand what it meant to be part of the church. So being in the ghetto actually brought him back to an understanding, a desire to know more about the faith that he was part of. And he also wrote that lots of young Jewish people in the ghetto were coming seeking for truth, seeking for more understanding of Jesus as Messiah. So who knows, folks, how many lights there were out there in society. So I'd like to conclude this little presentation by saying, why are we doing it? Why are we doing this research? And I haven't been on the case now for probably just about the last year, but we need to get back into it again. So why are we doing it? Well, first of all, we need to honour the memory of those people who were Jewish and who were part of the church. We need to honour their memory. Okay? And they died, they were murdered as Jewish people, but they're also part of the church. So we need to honour their memory. But I think an important part is, what do you think they would want? That's a question I always ask myself. What would they want to see come forth from their death? I'm sure they'd like to see that the seed that went into the ground would actually bear fruit. I'm sure that they would want to see other Jewish people today come to faith in Jesus as Messiah as a result of hearing of their testimony, of hearing of their story. And so that's why we continue to do what we're doing. So when you're talking about the Jewish community per se, every Jewish person knows about the Holocaust. If you want to have ministry to the Jewish people, you have to understand the Holocaust. It's part of the subconsciousness of Jewish people, because they always have that memory that they might have been safe in a society, and suddenly, just like that, that safety net was taken away because they were Jewish. So it's part of the reality of Jewish society. And they have a certain understanding in their mind, a certain perception concerning Christians, okay, that they are, in a sense, over there. They know that the occasional individual Christian person they sense is a true friend. But they've had their experiences throughout history, and they really don't have a great deal of trust in the church. Now, when it comes to Jewish people who follow Jesus as Messiah, they regard them oftentimes as traitors, as people who have actually sold out and gone to the other side because the other side offers them something better. That's their perception. And within all that, they don't realize just how many Jewish people who follow Jesus as Messiah actually did die in the Holocaust. They seem to think, perhaps, that because they're involved in the church, they all managed to get out. Well, in some countries that might have been the case, but in general we can say that probably was not the case. We can quite easily say, I think, that the vast majority of the Jewish people who are associated with the church actually died and went through the same hardships as all the other Jewish people. Now, we can't say that flippantly. If you want them to listen to that, you actually have to come up with some clear data. And so that's part of the reason also that we're doing what we can do. Apart from the fact that it's a part of the Holocaust that hasn't been thoroughly researched. I'm not the only one doing it. There are others who have touched it in different times in the past. There are some people out there today. But collectively, we hope that what we're doing can actually make some inroads. I've presented the books I've done, and plus a book my young daughter did as well, to the Holocaust Museum. And the person we gave it to was actually quite shocked that they never knew much about this particular area. So I'm hoping that following on from this, the work that myself and David Pileggi and others are involved in, that younger people in particular, others, can take it up and take the issue on further and further. But what about us today? How is this subject, how is this matter actually helpful for us today? Folks, we've got to be realistic. The Holocaust itself may not exactly happen as it did, but the spirit of the Holocaust is still out there. The same spirit of Antichrist that was out there then, and a desire to kill all the Jewish people because they are a testimony of the God who keeps covenant promises. That same spirit of Antichrist also killed a lot of Christians, priests, ministers, ordinary Christians, and would have continued to do so had the Nazis remained in power. That same spirit of Antichrist is out there today. So there are two witnesses, you might say, testifying to the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. One is the Jewish people, especially the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and two is the confessing church. Okay? People who actually confess faith in Jesus as Messiah, as the God incarnate Messiah, who took the penalty of death upon himself for humanity and rose again from the dead. We are a group that testifies that there is a God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who lives. So you might say there are two witnesses. And so there's an enemy out there, and there are movements out there, and there are ideologies out there that do not want to acknowledge the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Creator God, the Redeemer God. And so they will do all they can to destroy the evidence of the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if there's anything that we can perhaps learn as we must prepare ourselves for going through difficulties in the future, we can learn from those who've gone through difficult times in the past. And we can learn that in dark places, there was often a light that shone. And you don't need to have a big light to light up a dark place. Thank you.